My name is Sandra, and I want to tell you something that took me 41 years to learn. And silence can be the loudest sound in the room. And I grew up in a house where success was measured in one very specific way. You married well. You married early. You had children before 30. You lived close to the family. You showed up to every Sunday dinner with a husband on your arm and a casserole in your hands, and you smiled and you nodded, and you never ever talked about money unless you were talking about your husband's money. And that was the formula. That was the only formula. And for a very long time I believed that my refusal to follow that formula made me broken. And my older sister, Deborah, followed it perfectly. She married at 24. She had her first child at 26. She lived 12 minutes from my mother's house, and she made that casserole every single Sunday, without fail. Chicken and rice. Always chicken and rice. She drove a nice car that her husband paid for. She wore nice clothes that her husband paid for. She smiled a very specific smile that I now understand cost her something, but back then I just thought she was better at life than me. And my younger sister Patricia followed it almost perfectly. She married at 27, which my mother considered slightly late but acceptable. She had twins, which made everyone forget the timing issue entirely. She also lived close to home. She also came to Sunday dinners. She and Deborah would sit together at the table and talk about their husbands and their children and their houses, and I would sit across from them and feel like a creature from another planet. And I was the middle daughter, the difficult one, the one who had opinions, the one who asked too many questions, the one who looked at that formula and felt something close to panic every time someone tried to apply it to me. And I left our hometown at 22 with one suitcase, $1,000 in savings, and a job offer from a company in the city that paid $38,000 a year. My mother cried at the door. Not the proud kind of crying. The other kind. The kind that says, I do not understand you and that frightens me and somehow that is your fault. And my father shook my hand. He said, be careful out there. I think that was the most emotional he had ever been with me. And my sisters did not come to see me off. They were busy. They were always busy with the life that I was supposed to want. And the first 5 years in the city were hard in ways I could not have prepared for. And I was lonely in a way that felt physical. I would come home to my small apartment after a 10-hour day and sit on my secondhand couch and eat cereal for dinner and wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. I called my mother sometimes on those nights. She would ask if I had met anyone. I would say no. She would get quiet in a way that communicated everything she was not saying. Then she would tell me about Deborah's new kitchen renovation or Patricia's children's latest milestones, and I would hold the phone away from my ear and breathe and remind myself why I left. And I worked hard. That was the one thing I knew how to do without anyone teaching me. I worked before everyone else arrived and after everyone else left. I read every book I could find about finance and investing and business because I had decided very early that if I was going to do this alone, I was going to do it completely. No one was going to take care of me, so I was going to learn to take care of myself better than anyone else could. And I got promoted at 30. I got promoted again at 32. I started investing seriously at 33 when I finally had enough left over after rent and food and the student loans I was still paying down. I bought things I thought would make me feel less lonely. Clothes I did not need. A television that was too big for my apartment. A gym membership I used 4 times. I watched my account, and I learned from every single mistake, and I adjusted, and I kept going. And I did not get married. I want to be honest about this because it was not entirely by choice in the beginning. I dated. I tried. I met men who were kind and men who were not kind and men who were somewhere in between. I was in one relationship for 3 years that I genuinely thought might become something permanent. His name was Michael. He was smart and funny, and he made me feel seen in a way I had not expected. But Michael wanted a woman who would eventually stop working so hard. He said it gently at first. He said, I admire your drive, but I hope at some point you slow down. And then less gently later. He said, I feel like your career is your real relationship. And then at the end, he said, I need someone who will put me first. And I sat with that for a long time after he left. I examined it from every angle trying to figure out if he was right. if I was doing something wrong, if I needed to change. And I decided he was not right. Not for me. Maybe for someone else, but not for me. And I kept working. And the family reunion happened in September, and it almost did not happen at all for me. And my mother called in July to remind me. She used the word remind as though I had been eagerly anticipating it and simply needed a nudge. The reunion was at Deborah's house, which had been expanded twice since she bought it, and now had a back deck that Patricia had described to me on the phone as truly impressive. There would be aunts and uncles and cousins and a catered lunch, and my mother made it sound like a celebration, even though every reunion I had attended in the past decade had felt more like an audit. And an audit of my... I bought things I thought would make me feel less lonely. Clothes I did not need. A television that was too big for my apartment. A gym membership I used 4 times. I watched my account, and I learned from every single mistake, and I adjusted, and I kept going. And I did not get married. I want to be honest about this because it was not entirely by choice in the beginning. I dated. I tried. I met men who were kind and men who were not kind and men who were somewhere in between. I was in one relationship for 3 years that I genuinely thought might become something permanent. His name was Michael. He was smart and funny, and he made me feel seen in a way I had not expected. But Michael wanted a woman who would eventually stop working so hard. He said it gently at first. He said, I admire your drive, but I hope at some point you slow down. And then less gently later. He said, I feel like your career is your real relationship. And then at the end he said, I need someone who will put me first. And I sat with that for a long time after he left. I examined it from every angle trying to figure out if he was right. If I was doing something wrong. If I needed to change. And I decided he was not right. Not for me. Maybe for someone else, but not for me. And I kept working. And the family reunion happened in September, and it almost did not happen at all for me. And my mother called in July to remind me. She used the word remind as though I had been eagerly anticipating it and simply needed a nudge. The reunion was at Deborah's house, which had been expanded twice since she bought it, and now had a back deck that Patricia had described to me on the phone as truly impressive. There would be aunts and uncles and cousins and a catered lunch, and my mother made it sound like a celebration, even though every reunion I had attended in the past decade. Are you still in the city? Are you still at the same company? And then the pause. The specific pause that preceded the specific question. And are you seeing anyone? And I smiled each time. I said things that were true but brief. I watched the clock. And then we sat down to lunch. And I was placed between my Aunt Carol, who had never forgiven me for missing her 60th birthday party due to a work trip, and my cousin Melissa, who had gotten married the previous year and was newly pregnant and could not stop touching her stomach. Across from me were Deborah and Patricia and their husbands. My mother sat at the head of the table closest to me. And we ate for a while, and the conversation was the usual river of small updates and light laughter, and the kind of surface talk that keeps 12 people comfortable. And then my Uncle Richard, who is Deborah's father-in-law, and had the specific confidence of a man who had never once been told he was asking too many questions, said to the table in general, what a group. Everyone doing so well. Then he looked at me specifically with what I am sure he thought was a kind expression and said, Sandra, what about you? Still the career girl. And career girl. And I was 41 years old. And I said yes. Still working. And something at the table shifted in the way that things shift when everyone is thinking the same thought, and someone has just given them permission to let it surface. Deborah said to her husband something quiet that I did not fully hear, but I heard the word choices. Patricia smiled her sympathetic smile. My mother looked at her plate. And my Aunt Carol said, you know, Sandra, it is not too late. People find love at all ages. My cousin Melissa touched her stomach again and said, I used to think I was too focused on work too. And I want to be careful here because I do not want you to think I exploded. I did not explode. I have never been someone who explodes. And what I did was much quieter than that. And I set down my fork. I picked up my glass of water. I took a slow drink. And then I looked around that table at the faces of the people who had spent 20 years measuring me against a ruler I had not chosen. And I said something I had never said to them before. And I said, I want to share something with all of you. And the table got slightly quiet the way tables do when someone's tone signals that what comes next is not a recipe recommendation. And I said I have been thinking about whether to tell you this for a while. I said I know that money is not something we usually discuss here. I said, but I feel like there is a version of me that has been sitting at this table for 20 years and apologizing quietly for the life I chose, and I would like that to stop today. And my mother said, Sandra. And I said I am not trying to cause any trouble. I just want to be honest with you all for once. And then I told them my net worth. And I will not put the exact number in the story because numbers are not really the point. But I will tell you that it was a number none of them expected. It was a number that represented 20 years of working and learning and failing and adjusting and investing and choosing my future over my comfort on hundreds of occasions when comfort would have been much easier to choose. It was a number that my financial advisor had helped me understand represented genuine security. The kind of security that meant I could stop working tomorrow if I chose to and not worry about rent for the rest of my life. And I said it clearly. I did not whisper it. I did not couch it in apologies. And the table went silent. And not the brief pause between sentences silent. The real kind. The kind where you can hear the catering trays and the air conditioning and the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower 3 houses away. And Deborah's husband stared at his plate. And Patricia blinked several times. And my Uncle Richard, who had called me a career girl 45 seconds ago, opened his mouth and then closed it. And my mother looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. I could not fully read it. I am still not sure I can fully read it now when I think back on it. It was not pride exactly. It was something more complicated than pride. Something that had grief mixed into it. And my Aunt Carol said, oh. And that was it. Just oh. And my cousin Melissa had stopped touching her stomach. And I picked my fork back up. I took a bite of the chicken. It was very good chicken. The caterers had done a nice job. And after a moment I said, I am not telling you this to compete with anyone. I said I am telling you because for 20 years I have sat at this table and absorbed the suggestion that my life was somehow less than. That I was somehow failing. That the path I chose was something to be pitied or worried over. And I wanted you to understand that I made a different choice. Not a worse one. A different one. And it is a choice I am proud of. And no one said anything for another long moment. And then Deborah said, that is wonderful, Sandra. And her voice was careful. The 40% genuine warmth was still there, but the 60% performance had shifted into something else. Something closer to recalibration. And Patricia said, yes, that is really impressive, Sandra. And Greg, her husband, said, seriously, that is incredible. And my mother said nothing. She looked at the flowers in the center of the table. And what happened after that was strange and human, and I want to describe it accurately because I think it matters. And lunch continued. The conversation came back slowly the way water comes back into a container after you have tilted it. My Uncle Richard talked about something else entirely, as though he had not said career girl at all. My cousin Melissa asked me a genuine question about investing that surprised me with its thoughtfulness. I answered her honestly, and we talked for a few minutes, and it was the most real conversation I had at that table in years. And later, when people were getting dessert, Deborah found me near the catering table and stood beside me, and for a while neither of us spoke. Then she said, I did not know. I said, I know. She said, I think we always assumed you were struggling. I said, I know that too. She said, was it hard? Not asking about the money. Asking about something else, and we both understood what she was asking. And I said yes. A lot of it was very hard. And she nodded. She took a piece of cake. She said, I think I sometimes made it harder. And I looked at her. This was the most honest thing my sister had said to me in perhaps 15 years. And I said, thank you for saying that. And she did not hug me, and we did not cry, and the string music playing in the background did not swell. We just stood there for a minute eating dessert in a complicated but slightly lighter silence. And my mother found me before I left. The party was winding down, and people were gathering their bags and saying their warm and surface goodbyes, and she pulled me just slightly aside near the front hallway. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "I always thought you were unhappy." And I said, "I know you did." And she said, "Were you?" And I thought about this honestly. I said there were years that were very hard, but no, I do not think I was unhappy. I think I was lonely sometimes. I think I missed being understood. But unhappy is not the right word. And she said, "I thought you were punishing yourself." And I said I was building something. And she looked at me again in that expression I could not fully read. Then she put her hand on my cheek for just a moment the way she used to when I was small before the formula, and the expectations had grown up between us. And I said, "I am too." And I drove to the airport. I sat in the gate, and I watched planes, and I felt something I want to try to name accurately because it was not triumph. Triumph is too sharp and too loud for what it was. It was more like the feeling of setting down something heavy that you have been carrying for so long you forgot you were carrying it. A lightness that comes not from winning but from finally telling the truth in a room where the truth had never been welcome before. And I want to speak now to anyone who is reading this from a place I recognize. And maybe you are the one in your family who made a different choice. Maybe you left. Maybe you stayed, but you did not follow the formula. Maybe you chose your work or your independence or your own specific vision of a life, and you have sat at tables where the silence around your choices felt louder than any words. And I want you to know that building something real takes the time it takes. It does not look impressive in the middle. In the middle, it looks like cereal for dinner and secondhand couches and early mornings and a phone call home where you hold the receiver away from your ear and breathe. And in the middle, it looks like failing according to other people's definitions. And I want you to know that other people's definitions are not the only definitions. And I am not telling you that money is the point. The number I said at that table was never the point. The point was 20 years of showing up for myself in a world that kept suggesting I should show up differently. The point was the decision I made at 22 with one suitcase and $1,000 to trust the version of my life that lived inside me rather than the version that lived in other people's expectations. And the silence at that table was not about money. And it was about 20 years of assumptions meeting 20 years of quiet truth. And it was the sound of a story being corrected. And I went back to the city on a Sunday evening, and I opened my apartment door, and I stood in the living room that is no longer furnished with secondhand pieces, but still has the quality of a place that was built slowly and deliberately by someone who knew what she was doing. And I made tea. I sat by the window. I watched the city do what cities do in the evening, which is glow in a way that has always reminded me of why I came here in the first place. And my phone had a message from Melissa asking if I would be willing to talk more about investing. I replied yes. I meant it. And there was a message from Patricia that said today was really good. I was glad you were there. I replied that I was glad too. And there was no message from Deborah. That was fine. Some corrections take longer to settle than others, and I had waited this long. I could be patient. And there was a message from my mother. It said 4 words. And I am proud of you. And I held the phone for a long time. And I want to tell you what those 4 words felt like, but I am not sure I have language precise enough. It was not the relief of being validated, because I had stopped needing her validation somewhere around year 7 of building my life without it. It was something quieter and older than that. It was the feeling of a door that had been almost closed for a very long time opening just slightly. Not all the way. Not enough to change everything. But enough to let some air through. And enough. And I finished my tea. I watched the city. I thought about everything I had built, and everything it had cost me, and everything I would not trade. And then I washed my cup. I put it back in the cabinet. I went to sleep. And in the morning I got up and I kept building. And my family called me the failure. At the reunion I shared my net worth and the table went silent.